The silence had lasted 40 years, and the spore mothers of the pale increase had come to love it. Broodreader Sosh Veltara hung in the warm dark of the listening shell, her sensing fronds combed flat against the wall, and she counted the quiet of the human star for the 11,000th time. 40 years of nothing. 40 years of a small yellow sun, behind a cold blue world, that gave back no signal, no challenge, no prayer. In the language of the increase there was a word for a place like that. The word meant fallow. It meant a field that had been left to rest, ripe for the seeding, asking to be filled. Sosh had been a juvenile when the first survey kissed that system, and came home with its fronds curled in disappointment. The survey had logged a single artificial object near the blue world, a long gray shape that hung in a high orbit and did nothing, that broadcast nothing, that answered no hail in 40 years of patient listening. The survey had marked it derelict. The survey had marked the whole system spent, and spent meant fallow, and fallow meant hours. She drank that thought the way her kind drank everything, slowly, with the whole body. The increase did not hurry. The increase had eaten 900 worlds across 4,000 years and never once been hurried, because hurry was for things that could be stopped, and nothing stopped the increase. They came to a silent world. They breathed their seed into its waters and its winds. They waited. In a generation the world was theirs, crust to cloud, every living thing on it folded into the long, warm body of the brood. They did not fight wars. They did not need to. They simply arrived where no one was strong enough to say no, and the silent places never were. That was the whole faith of the pale increase, written in spore and patience. Loud worlds resisted. Loud worlds shouted, and armed, and burned their seed before it could root. So the increase listened for the quiet ones, and no world in all the surveyed dark had been as quiet, for as long, as the blue world behind the small yellow sun. There was an old teaching among the brood readers, taught to every juvenile before they were trusted with a sensing shell. A world that shouts is a world that is afraid. A world that is afraid is a world that has something to fear, and a world that has nothing to say has nothing to defend, because the strong announce their strength, always, so that the weak will not test it. A silent world, the teaching said, is a world that has already surrendered and does not yet know the word for it. Sosh had believed that teaching her whole life. She believed it still, in this hour, as the small yellow sun grew from a point to a coin, to a warm and waiting eye. She had no reason not to. 40 years of data lay coiled in the listening shell, 40 years of a world that did exactly what a surrendered world should do, which was nothing at all. The numbers did not lie. The numbers had never lied. The blue world was fallow, and the increase had come to fill it. She uncurled, and let herself drift toward the command bladder, where the first mother waited. The fleet around her was not a fleet the way harder peoples built fleets. It was a drift of 312 seed vessels, each one grown rather than welded, soft-hulled and pale, each carrying in its belly enough living spore to fill an ocean and a sky. They moved without engines that roared. They moved on the slow push of bred muscle and the long pull of patience, and they had been moving toward the silent system for 19 years. Now they were close. Now the small yellow sun was a coin of light ahead, and the blue world was a held breath, and the long gray derelict in its high orbit was exactly where the survey had left it 40 years before, dead, drifting, saying nothing. Sosh passed through the warm corridors of the lead vessel as she went, and everywhere the drift was preparing for the seeding, the way it had prepared 900 times before. Tenders combed the spore stores, testing the warmth of the living seed, singing the low songs that kept it ripe. Younger readers practiced the resonance that would call the seed out of the bellies and down into a world's water. There was no fear anywhere in the drift, and no urgency, because the increase had done this so many times that the seeding of a world was less an act of war than an act of digestion. They were not soldiers going to battle. They were a vast, slow mouth, closing, at last, around a thing too quiet to pull away. The first mother filled the command bladder like a tide. She was old past counting, her body pale as bone and vast as a hall, and she had presided over the seeding of 40 worlds. When Sosh entered, the old one's fronds turned toward her without hurry. "Speak the field," the first mother said. "The field is fallow," Sosh answered, and the words tasted like ripe water. 40 years silent. One artifact, derelict. No power signature. No answer to any hail across 4 decades. No defense grid. No challenge. The blue world below carries life, dense and warm, but no voice reaches up from it. They have not even learned to shout. First Mother, they do not know we are here. They do not know anyone is here. They are alone, and they are quiet, and they are ours. A ripple of pleasure moved through the great pale body. 40 years, the First Mother murmured. A patient field. A field that waited for us without knowing it waited. 40 years is a fine, long, quiet Sosh. Do you know how many worlds have given us 40 years of silence before we came? No, First Mother. None, the old one said. Not one. The loud ones we take in a season, when their shouting tells us where to push. The quiet ones go quiet for a few years, a decade, and then some new fear wakes them, and they begin to arm, to call out, to build. 40 years of perfect silence has never happened. This world is the quietest field the increase has ever found. It has lain fallow so long it has forgotten there is anything but the resting. It is the gentlest seeding we will ever do. She let the pleasure roll through her again. Bring us to the threshold. Begin the seeding tide. We will fill their oceans first, and then their winds. And in 1 generation, this small yellow sun will warm a world of the increase, and the gray dead thing in their sky will rot where it drifts, a monument to a people too silent to live. Sosh sang the order down through the drift, frond to frond, vessel to vessel. 312 pale hulls turned their slow noses toward the blue world. The seeding tide began to gather in their bellies, warm and thick and ready. The increase had come, as it always came, to a place too quiet to fight back. And in the high cold orbit, the long gray derelict that had said nothing for 40 years did a thing it had not done in all that time. It woke up. There was no roar. There was no flare of weapons. There was only a single thread of signal, thin as a hair, that uncoiled from the gray hull and reached out across the dark toward the blue world below. Sosh's sensing fronds caught the edge of it and stiffened, because it was not a hail, and it was not a challenge, and it was not a prayer. It was a broadcast. One narrow beam, aimed down at the silent world, carrying a single packed pulse of data, and then it closed again, and the gray hull went still. First Mother, Sosh said slowly. The derelict has transmitted. To whom? The old one did not sound concerned. Nothing concerned the increase. There is no one to receive. The world is silent. It has been silent for 40 years. Yes, Sosh said. It has. But her fronds would not lie flat again, and she did not know why. She combed back through the 40 years of data, fast now, the way she had never combed it before, and she found the thing she had never looked for, because the teaching had told her it would not be there. In 40 years, the gray derelict had not been entirely dead. 11 times, across 4 decades, it had stirred for a fraction of a second, a flicker of warmth so faint the survey had logged it as drift noise, and moved on. 11 flickers in 40 years. She had always read them as a dead thing settling. She read them now as something else. As a thing turning over in its sleep. As a thing checking, once every few years, that the field was still coming. First Mother, she said, and her voice had changed. I do not think the derelict is dead. I think it has been awake the whole time. I think it has been watching us watch it. The First Mother did not answer at once. When she did, her warmth had cooled by the smallest degree. Then it is one watcher on one dead hull, Sosh, against 312 full bellies and 4,000 years. Begin the tide. Whatever it transmitted, there is no one beneath it to hear. Far below, on the cold blue world that had said nothing for 40 years, the broadcast arrived. It struck a buried antenna under a sheet of polar ice, and it ran down a cable into a room no alien instrument had ever found. And in that room, a light that had been dark for 4 decades turned, very quietly, green. The light meant one word. The word was not fallow. The word was wake. And 10,000 feet beneath the ice, and on the dark side of 3 moons, and in the long cold orbits the survey had never bothered to chart, things that had been waiting 40 years for exactly this signal began, without a sound, to move. The gray derelict had a name, though no one of the increase had ever asked it. Painted on its cold flank in letters no spore could read, was the word Vigil, and under that, smaller, the words Earth Deep Watch, Outpost 2. It was not a derelict. It had never been a derelict, it was a listening station, and the thing aboard it that had just sent a single word down the gravity well to a sleeping world was a woman named Comms Master Lena Orsk, and she had been awake the entire 40 years. Not awake the way a living thing is awake. The crew of the Vigil ran cold, in shifts that lasted a decade each, sleeping in long frozen rest, while the station listened with its own quiet machines, and woke a watcher only when something moved. Lena had taken the third shift. She had slept through the first contact survey, slept through 19 years of the slow pale drift growing in the deep instruments, and she had been woken 11 months ago by a single soft chime that meant the field is being measured. She had watched the pale increase come for 11 months without once letting the station make a sound louder than a sleeping heart. She had watched 312 soft pale hulls gather at the edge of the system. She had read their slow songs, frond to frond, and her machines had learned enough of the spore tongue to know one word above all the others. Fallow. Lena had let them believe it. That was the whole art of the Deep Watch, and she had trained for it from the year she turned 19. You do not answer a hail you cannot win. You do not arm where arming only tells the enemy you are armed. You go quiet, and you stay quiet, and you let the thing that hunts the quiet come all the way in, close, soft, certain, until it is standing in the middle of the trap, and the trap is the size of a star. 40 years of silence was not weakness. 40 years of silence was the longest, coldest, most patient ambush a thinking species had ever set, and the pale increase had spent 19 years walking into the center of it, singing about fallow fields the whole way down. It had cost. That was the part the surveys never weighed, because surveys counted hulls and signals and never counted the price of a held breath. Lena thought about the cost sometimes, in the long, cold shifts. The Deep Watch had learned, 40 years ago, exactly what the pale increase was. They had found one of the 900 eaten worlds, a place that had once shouted and armed and built and called for help, and had been folded into the warm pale body anyway, because shouting only told the increase where to push. The Deep Watch had stood in the ruins of that loud, brave world, and understood the terrible lesson written there. Against a breeder that hunts the quiet, you cannot be loud. Loud is what the 900 were. Loud is what gets you eaten with a survey note that says the field resisted briefly. So Earth had chosen, 40 years before Lena was born into the Watch, to do the one thing no eaten world had ever done. It had chosen to be quiet on purpose, to build its whole strength in the dark where no survey would look, to go fallow as a lure and wait, however long it took, for the hunter of silence to come and try to seed the silence, and bring its entire carried faith into the one place in the galaxy built to take it. 40 years. Lena had given a third of that. 2 other comms masters had given the thirds before her, and she had never met them, and never would, because the Watch did not gather, and did not speak, and did not write its names anywhere a survey might find. She knew them only as the first hand and the second hand, the ones who had held the silence before her so that she could hold it now. She thought of them as she keyed the long-range relay for the first time in her shift, and the first time the Vigil had spoken above a whisper in 40 years. Deep Watch Actual. This is Outpost 2, she said, and her voice was very calm and very flat. Field is seated. Repeat. The field is seated. 312 hulls. Soft, slow, full bellies. They have begun the tide. You are clear to move. There was a pause of 4 seconds while the signal crossed the dark. Then a voice answered her, dry and old and entirely unhurried. Outpost 2, Deep Watch Actual. We hear you. We have heard you for 11 months. Stand your station and keep your eyes open. We are moving now. The voice belonged to Fleet Master Idris Calloway, aboard the flagship of the thing the pale increase had spent 40 years failing to notice. The survey had charted one gray artifact in the blue world's high orbit and marked the system spent. The survey had not charted the dark side of the 3 moons. It had not charted the long, cold parking orbits beyond the 8th planet, where the sunlight was too thin to gleam off a hull. It had not charted the deep trench under the polar ice where the keels were laid. The increase listened for loud worlds, and a loud world tells you where its strength is. Earth had simply never told. Lena turned the vigil's eyes outward, away from the pale drift, toward the cold, dark places of her own system, and she watched her people move. They came off the dark moons first. There was no flare of drives, because the Deep Watch did not run hot when it did not have to. There was only a change in the dark, a place where the stars had been and now were not, as 40 long gray shapes slid out of the lee of the nearest moon and put their cold noses toward the pale drift. Behind them, off the second moon, 40 more. Off the third, 40 more. From the thin, cold orbits beyond the 8th planet, where the survey's instruments had seen only empty night, a fourth wall of gray shapes lit their station-keeping thrusters one breath at a time and began to fall inward toward the small yellow sun. Lena counted them as they came, the way she had been trained to count, because numbers were the Deep Watch faith, the way patience was the faith of the increase. 160 hulls off the moons, 80 off the deep orbits, and from the trench beneath the polar ice, rising slow through 10,000 feet of black water and breaking the surface in a silent boil of shattered flows, the heavy ones, the keel ships, the ones the Deep Watch had spent 40 years building where no eye in the sky could see, 40 more gray hulls, broad and cold and bristling, that had never once tasted starlight until this hour. 280 ships, against 312 soft pale hulls full of spore. It was not a larger fleet. The Deep Watch had never cared to field a larger fleet. It cared to field a fleet that arrived where it was not expected, that had measured its enemy for 19 years, while the enemy measured an empty field, and that struck not at flesh, but at the one thing a breeder empire could not afford to lose. Lena watched the keel ships rise from the ice, and felt something move in her chest that she had no clean name for. She had served 40 years in a system that pretended to be empty, and she had never once seen those ships, because they had been built in the dark, under 10,000 feet of black water, precisely so that no eye, hers included, would ever catch them and let the secret slip. They were the heart of the trap, and even the watcher who guarded the trap had not been trusted to see them until the hour they were needed. Now they breached the polar sea in a silent storm of broken ice, and turned their broad, cold faces toward the small yellow sun, and Lena understood that she was looking at the part of her own people she had spent her whole life not being allowed to know. The Deep Watch kept its secrets even from itself. That was how a secret survives 40 years. You do not tell the watcher the shape of the sword, you only tell her when to send the word that draws it. But the keel ships were Calloway's part, and the closing was still an hour away. Lena's part was to keep her station silent a little longer, to be the cold gray derelict in the high orbit for one more hour, while the gray walls closed, because the longer the increase believed the system fallow, the closer they would let the trap come before it shut. She watched the First Mother's drift in her instruments, and saw, with a feeling she did not have a clean word for, the moment the increase began to suspect. It started in the pale hulls nearest the moons. Their slow songs changed key. The word fallow guttered, and a new word rose in its place, a word her machines translated as movement in the empty quarter. A single seed vessel turned its soft nose away from the blue world and toward the dark moon it had been ignoring for 19 years, and its sensing fronds reached out into the night and found, where it had expected nothing, 40 cold gray walls. Aboard that vessel, a broodreader screamed a song down the drift, and the song was the first frightened sound the pale increase had made in 4,000 years. Lena heard it cross her instruments, and she allowed herself, alone in the cold command deck of the Vigil, the smallest possible smile. "They've seen the moons," she reported, flat as ever. "Drift is reorienting. First Mother's vessel is pulling the tide back from the well." "Good," said Calloway's dry voice. "Let them pull. A breeder cannot run, Outpost 2. They are full of spore and slow as syrup, and they have nowhere to put 19 years of patience. Keep watching. Tell me when she sings to her young." Lena did not understand that last part, not yet, but she watched, and she listened, and she kept the Vigil silent, the cold gray derelict that was about to become the worst 40 years of memory the pale increase would ever carry. Far out at the edge of the drift, the First Mother filled her command bladder and tried, for the first time in 4,000 years, to understand a field that had lied to her. 40 years, the old one said, and her voice had lost its warm certainty. 40 years silent, saw she, Read me the empty quarter. Read me what hides off the moons. Sosh Veltara combed her fronds toward the dark and read, and what she read made her old still body go cold all the way through. Hard hulls, first mother, metal, welded, not grown. 200 and more, coming off the moons and the deep orbits, and rising from the world's own ice. They were here. They were here the whole 19 years. They were here the whole 40. They have been watching us measure their field, and they let us measure it, and they let us come. The first mother did not answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice was the voice of a thing that has eaten 900 worlds and has just understood, far too late, that this one had been eating it. The flickers, she said. Sosh, the 11 flickers in the dead hull. You read them right. It was never dead. It was a watcher, and the watcher was counting us. And every few years, it turned over to make certain we were still coming. We were the field. We were always the field. They went silent 40 years ago to grow this, and we mistook the patience of a hunter for the surrender of prey. Her vast pale body shuddered through the whole bladder. What does a quiet world fear? That it would build all this in the dark and never once shout. First mother. Sosh said softly. It feared us. It learned what we are, and it decided that the only way to beat a thing that hunts the quiet was to become the quiet, and wait. Then it knows us, the first mother said. It has had 40 years to learn us, and we have had a single hour to learn it. She gathered herself, and gave the only order 4,000 years had taught her to give when a field turned out to have teeth. Burn the seed, before they reach us. Empty the bellies, seed the dark, seed the cold, seed anything, but do not let them take the spore. The spore is the increase, the spore is everything. If we lose the hulls, we are nothing, but if we lose the seed, we are dead. It was a wise order. It was 19 years too late. Because the thing the Deep Watch had measured, in all those patient years of listening to the slow, pale songs, was not the number of the hulls, or the speed of the drift, or the warmth of the bellies. The thing the Deep Watch had measured was the one truth a breeder empire keeps closest and guards worst. They had learned exactly how the pale increase carried its seed, and they had built 280 gray ships to take it, all of it, every spore in every belly, without spilling a single living thing on the blue world below, or the cold worlds around it. Calloway had not come to kill the increase. The Deep Watch did not come to kill. He had come to do something a breeder empire had never once, in 4,000 years, imagined could be done to it. He had come to harvest the harvesters. And as the first mother sang her frightened order down the drift, the gray walls finished closing, and the small yellow sun looked down on 312 soft pale hulls that had come to seed a quiet world, and found themselves ringed on every side by the cold, patient strength of a people who had spent 40 years learning to be silent, so that this single hour could be loud. Sosh had seeded a world once, in her youth, and the memory rose in her now, as the gray walls closed, uninvited, the way a thing you have done to others returns to you when it is being done to you. It had been a small green world, 300 years before, a place that had gone quiet, only 11 years when the increase came. The survey had marked it fallow on the thin evidence of a decade of silence, and the drift had come, and Sosh, a young reader then, had sung the seeding resonance down into its warm blue sea for the first time in her life. She remembered the feel of it. She remembered the world's water taking the spore the way dry ground takes rain, greedily, completely, with no idea what it was drinking. She remembered the single signal the world had managed to send, in the last hour, when the seed was already in the sea and the folding had begun, a thin, desperate call across the dark to anyone, to please, to help. And she remembered that no one had answered, because no one ever answered the quiet worlds, because the quiet worlds were quiet precisely because they had no one. That had been the lesson the increase taught itself over and over for 4,000 years. The quiet are alone. The alone are weak. The weak are food. Sosh had believed it her whole life. She had sung that belief into a green world sea, and watched the sea answer. And she had felt, the way her kind felt everything, a slow, warm certainty that this was simply the shape of the dark. Strong things ate quiet things. The increase was strong because it was patient, and patience always in the end found a quiet world that could not say no. She thought of that green world now, in the closing gray ring, and she understood for the first time in 300 years what its last signal had truly meant. It had not been weakness, it had been the bravest thing a small world could do, to call out into the dark, knowing no one would answer, to refuse the silence even at the end. And the increase had heard that brave refusal, and read it as the bleating of food, because the increase could not imagine a silence that was anything but surrender, and so it could not imagine a call for help that was anything but the last gasp of a thing already lost. The humans, Sosh saw now, had imagined it. They had stood in the ruins of a world exactly like that green one, a world that had called out and gotten no answer, and they had decided to become the answer, not for that world, which was already gone, for the next one, for every quiet world that would ever call into the dark and need someone, anyone, to be waiting. The humans had made themselves into the help that the green world had begged for and never received. They had simply done it the only way that worked against a thing like the increase, which was to never let the increase know they were there at all, until it was far too late to matter. First Mother, Sosh said softly, into the closing ring. 300 years ago, I seeded a green world. It called for help at the end. Do you remember it? I remember 1,000 worlds that called for help at the end, the First Mother said. They all called. None were answered. That is the dark, Sosh. That is the only law of it. No, Sosh said, and it was the first time in her long life she had told the First Mother she was wrong. That was the old law. The humans have written a new one. The quiet worlds called into the dark for 4,000 years and got nothing back. And somewhere in those 4,000 years, one of those calls reached a people who decided to answer all of them at once, forever, by becoming the worst thing that could possibly be waiting in a silence. We did not come to a fallow field, First Mother. We came to the answer. We came to the thing the green world was calling for. And it has been here, in the dark, getting ready to answer us, for 40 years. The First Mother was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, the eastern wall of gray ships finished closing the ring, and the small yellow sun was caged behind a fence of cold, patient hulls, and the drift hung in the center of it, with 312 full bellies, and nowhere left to go. Then we are the green world now, the First Mother said at last, very quietly. We are the quiet thing that called itself strong, surrounded, with the seed already as good as gone, calling into the dark for a help that is not coming. Is that what you are telling me, Sosh? Yes, First Mother. And will anyone answer us? Sosh combed her fronds flat against the wall of the listening shell and read the dark all around them, the 280 gray ships, the caged sun, the high, cold derelict that had never been a derelict, and she gave the First Mother the truest answer she had. Someone already has, she said. That is the whole horror of it. The humans answered the green world's call 300 years too late to save the green world, and they have spent every year since making certain they would never be too late again. We are not the ones being abandoned in the dark, First Mother. We are the ones the answer came for, and the answer is all around us, and it is patient, and it is not going to let us go free to seed another green world ever again. The First Mother did not speak after that. She watched the ring close, and she felt the seed dying slowly in her bellies, and she gave the order to burn it before the gray ships could take it. And the seed would not burn, because the answer had thought of that too, 300 years ago, in the ruins of a world that had called into the dark, and been heard at last by exactly the wrong thing to ever want to face. Lena Orsk keyed her relay one more time. Fleetmaster, the ring is closed. She's ordered them to dump the seed. I know, said Calloway. We've been waiting 40 years for her to try. Outpost 2, hold your eyes on the bellies. You're about to watch us take a god's whole faith away from it, and I want a clean record. The vigil held its eyes on the bellies, and the deep watch moved. The First Mother gave the order to burn the seed, and the seed did not burn. Sosh felt it first as a wrongness in the drift. The nearest seed vessel opened its dumping vents to spill its belly into the cold dark, the way a hunted breeder had spilled seed 1,000 times across 4,000 years, and the spore should have poured out into space in a pale, ungovernable cloud, lost but not taken, denied to the enemy forever. That was the last mercy of the increase. You could never truly be robbed, because you could always let the seed go free. The spore poured out, and then it stopped, and hung, and gathered itself into a tight pale knot, and turned, against every law Sosh had ever learned, back toward the gray ships that ringed them. "First Mother," Sosh said, and her voice shook. "They are holding the seed, the dumped spore. It will not scatter. It is being pulled." She did not have the word for what the gray ships were doing, because her people had never built such a thing. The Deep Watch had. The 40 keel ships risen from the polar trench were not warships in any shape the Increase would recognize. They were containment vessels, and across their broad, cold flanks ran emitters that reached out into the dark and took hold of the dumped spore the way a careful hand takes a spilled thing off a table, gently, completely, without crushing a single grain. The Deep Watch had spent 19 years learning the exact resonance that the living spore answered to, and now they sang it back. 280 hulls in a cold, patient chorus, and the spore came when it was called. It came because the Deep Watch had learned the one secret the First Mother guarded worst. The spore was alive. The spore could be reached, and a thing that can be reached can be gathered. Lena watched it from the high orbit and forgot, for a moment, to breathe. Across the whole closed ring, the pale clouds of dumped seed were rising off the soft hulls and streaming inward, not lost, not scattered, but folded into the broad open holds of the gray keel ships, harvested out of the dark grain by grain. The Increase was trying to spill its faith into the void, and the void was handing it to the humans. It was the strangest battle she had ever seen, and she had studied every battle the Deep Watch kept records of. There was no fire. There was no breaking. There was only a slow, vast, patient gathering, 280 gray ships moving through the closed ring, like tenders through a harvest field, and the harvest was the living faith of a 4,000-year-old god, and it was being brought in grain by the hand that had baited the whole thing with silence. There was one moment, in the long hours of the harvest, when the pale Increase came closer to victory than it would ever know. It happened on the dark side of the third moon, where 40 of the gray ships had come off the lee and closed the eastern wall of the ring. The Increase, in its panic, had found the single seam in the trap that the Deep Watch had not been able to make perfect, a narrow lane between the third moon and the deep cold orbits, where the gravity of two bodies tugged the formation a hair's breadth wider than the rest of the ring. A brood reader, on a vessel near that lane, felt the seam the way a hunted thing feels a draft under a door, and it sang the seam to the First Mother, and the First Mother did the one clever thing she did in the whole 12 hours. She ordered 40 of her fullest hulls to run the seam together, all at once, in a single thick pale wedge, and to spend everything they had carrying their seed out through the gap and away into the dark, where the gray ships could not follow with their slow, careful holds. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that won, against a lesser people. The 40 hulls turned as one, and drove for the seam with the last desperate strength of a thing fighting for its faith, and for 11 seconds the seam held open, and the lead hull was halfway through, and the seed in 40 bellies was about to escape the harvest and live free in the dark to seed some other quiet world 1,000 years from now. Aboard the gray ship that held the third moon wall, a vessel named the Long Patience, the watch officer saw the wedge come and did the thing the Deep Watch had drilled into its people for 40 years. He did not panic. He did not fire. He did not call for help. He counted. He counted the speed of the wedge and the width of the seam and the slow turning weight of his own ship, and he understood in a heartbeat that he could not close the seam in time with the Long Patience alone, and he understood, in the same heartbeat, exactly what he could do instead. He spent his ship, not its life. The Deep Watch did not spend lives, not even against a thing that had eaten 900 worlds. He spent its position. The Long Patience cut every other duty, and threw its whole bred and built strength into a single hard burn across the mouth of the seam, not to ram, not to fire, but to put its long gray body sideways across the gap, like a hand laid flat over a hole, and to sing the calling resonance straight down the throat of the running wedge. 40 fleeing hulls drove for a seam and found the seam filled with a wall of gray and a note older than their own, and the note reached into their bellies and took hold of the seed even as they ran, and the seed they were trying to carry to freedom poured backward out of them into the holds of the very ship, blocking their escape. The wedge broke against the Long Patience and spilled its faith into the Long Patience and was harvested by the Long Patience, all 40 hulls, in 19 seconds, and not one of them was so much as scratched, and not one grain of seed was lost to the dark. The seam closed. The last clever plan of the Pale Increase died in the holds of a single gray ship that had been built, 40 years before, in a trench under 10,000 feet of black water, for exactly this. Lena Orsk watched it from the high orbit of the Vigil, and felt her heart go up into her throat, and stay there for the whole 19 seconds, and then come slowly down again. She had seen the seam form. She had seen the wedge run for it. For 11 seconds, she had been certain, with the cold clarity of 40 years of training, that 40 hulls were going to escape, and that the harvest would be a fraction less than perfect, and that somewhere in the long dark future, 40 bellies of increase would find another quiet world, and the cycle would turn again. And then the long patience had laid itself across the gap, and counted, and sung, and the certainty had reversed in a single breath, and Lena had understood, watching it, the thing the Deep Watch could never quite teach a recruit in the classroom, and could only teach in the cold dark of a real hour. The strength of the watch was not its walls. It was not its ships, or its armor, or even its 40 years of silence. The strength of the watch was that every single person in it, on every single hull, had spent their whole life learning to count, and to wait, and to do the exact right small thing at the exact right instant, so that no seam ever stayed open long enough to matter. The First Mother had 4,000 years of patience. The Deep Watch had something the First Mother could not understand, because it was made of the one thing her kind had never needed. The Deep Watch had practice. It had drilled this hour 10,000 times in the cold dark, on every ship, for 40 years, against an enemy that had only ever done this once. Third moon seam closed, Lena reported, and she was proud, in that moment, that her voice came out as flat as the count. The long patience took the wedge clean. 40 hulls, all dry, no losses, no escape. The seam is sealed. Confirmed, said Calloway's dry voice. Good count from the long patience. Log the officer's name. That was the only door they had, Outpost 2, and he shut it before they finished walking through it. 40 years we built that ship for one closed seam, and it earned the whole 40 in 19 seconds. A pause. That was their best moment. It is behind them now. Everything after this is just the counting. And it was. After the third moon seam closed, the Pale Increase had no plan left that 4,000 years had not already given it, and the Deep Watch had not already answered. The scattering had been answered. The ramming had been answered. The singing against had been answered. The one clever run for the one real seam had been answered by a single gray ship, doing the exact thing it was built to do. There was nothing left in the long memory of the Increase that the watch had not measured and met, and so the harvest simply went on, grain by grain, hull by hull, the way the survey had never imagined a quiet world could make it go. Lena sat with that through the long middle hours, and she thought about the word the survey had used, fallow. She thought about how the Increase had read 40 years of silence and seen a field that had given up, and she thought about what the silence had actually been, all those years, in the cold dark above the warm blue world. It had not been a field giving up. It had been 40 years of 10,000 small drills on 280 ships, 40 years of officers, like the one on the Long Patience, learning to count a seam closed in 19 seconds, 40 years of armor alloyed grain by grain, in a black trench, against weapons no one had yet fired. The silence had been the loudest 40 years of work a people had ever done. It had only looked like surrender from the outside, because the whole art of it was to look like surrender from the outside, right up until the hour it laid itself across the seam and shut the door. The Increase had spent 4,000 years learning to read silence, and it had read this one exactly wrong, because it had never once imagined that a silence could be a thing a people chose, and built, and drilled, and sharpened, on purpose, in the dark, for 40 patient years, against the precise day the readers would come. They are not killing us, Sosh said, and the realization was worse than any death song. First Mother, they are not killing us. They are taking the seed. They are taking all of it. They will leave us the empty hulls. The First Mother went very still in her command bladder. A breeder empire does not fear death. Death is only the loss of a body, and the Increase had bodies past counting. A breeder empire fears one thing, the single thing it cannot make again, the thing that is the empire itself, and not merely its hands, the seed. The living spore that carried 4,000 years of the increase forward, that turned silent worlds into warm body, that was the difference between a god and a drifting bag of pale meat. Lose the hulls and you grow more. Lose the seed, and there is nothing left to grow them from. There is no increase. There is only the dark, and 312 soft pale shapes full of empty bellies, slowly forgetting how to be a god. Strike them, the First Mother said, and for the first time in 4,000 years, the pale increase tried to fight. Strike the gray hulls. Spill them open. They cannot hold the seed if they are broken. Strike. The seed vessels had weapons. They were poor ones, grown not built, meant for the rare loud world that did not die quietly enough. They were lashes of bred lightning and gouts of digesting acid, the tools of a thing that eats rather than wars. 312 pale hulls turned them on the gray ring and struck with everything 4,000 years of patience had stored. The Deep Watch had measured those weapons for 19 years, and the gray ships did not even slow. Calloway's voice crossed Lena's relay, dry as old paper. Outpost 2. Log it. They're firing. Note that none of our hulls returns fire on the bellies. We are not here to spill the seed. We are here to take it. Hold formation, all gray. Let them spend themselves on the armor and keep harvesting. The bred lightning broke white across the cold gray hulls and ran off into the dark. The digesting acid struck the keel ships and froze to useless slag against armor grown for exactly this. Armor the Deep Watch had alloyed in the deep trench out of 40 years of patient knowledge. Not one gray ship broke, not one belly was reached, and all the while, the cold, patient chorus went on, the resonance that called the seed home, and grain by grain, the faith of the pale increase poured out of the soft hulls and into the gray holds, and the First Mother felt her god, draining away into the dark. Socius watched the harvest and understood, at last, what 40 years of silence had been. It had not been weakness. It had not been a fallow field waiting to be filled. It had been a trap baited with the one thing the increase could never resist, an apparently empty quiet, and the Deep Watch had set it 40 years ago, and gone cold, and waited, knowing that sooner or later, a breeder empire would come and try to seed the silence, and bring its whole carried faith into the one place in the galaxy built to take it. They wanted us to come, Sosh said softly, First Mother. The silence was the bait. We were never the seeders. We were the field. They have been growing this harvest for 40 years, and we are the crop. The First Mother did not answer. She was watching the harvest reach her own vessel. Across the closed ring, 60 of the 312 hulls were already empty, their bellies hollow, their fronds gone limp with a despair no breeder had felt in 4,000 years. The gray keel ships moved among them with a slow, terrible gentleness, never firing, never breaking, simply taking, gathering the spilled and the unspilled seed alike into holds. The Deep Watch had built to hold a god. And the First Mother, oldest of the increase, mother of 40 seeded worlds, watched her empire die not in fire, but in subtraction, grain by patient grain, exactly the way her own kind had taken 900 worlds. She tried, in those hours, every tactic 4,000 years had stored. She ordered the drift to scatter, to break the ring and flee in 300 directions so the gray ships could not hold them all. The drift tried. The gray ships did not chase. They did not need to. A seed vessel without its seed had no reason to run and no place to run to. And the moment a hull broke for the dark, a keel ship simply finished emptying it where it fled and let the hollow shape drift off, harmless, a husk. Scattering only fed them faster. She ordered the seed vessels to ram, to drive their soft bodies into the gray hulls and crush the harvesters under their own weight. The drift tried that too. The keel ships took the blows on armor grown in the trench and did not so much as drift off station, and the soft hulls that rammed them split open and spilled their bellies straight into the waiting holds, and the ramming became the easiest harvest of all. She ordered the readers to find the resonance the humans were singing and to sing against it, to fight the calling note with a calling note of their own, to pull the seed back into the bellies. Sosh tried that hardest of all, combing the human chorus for its key, and she found it, and she sang against it with everything she had, and it did not matter. The Deep Watch had been studying that resonance for 19 years. Soshin had been studying it for an hour. The human note was deeper, older, more patient, and it had been written specifically to win this exact contest. And the seed answered the older note, and came home to the gray holds, and left the bellies empty. There was nothing in 4,000 years that worked, because the Deep Watch had spent 40 of those years learning everything the increase would try, and had built the whole trap to answer all of it at once. Lena Orsk recorded all of it from the high, cold orbit of the Vigil, and somewhere in the long, silent hours of the harvest, she found she could not feel the triumph she had trained 40 years to earn. She watched the pale hulls go limp and dark as their bellies emptied, and she keyed her relay one more time. "Fleetmaster," she said. 60 hulls emptied. They've stopped firing. The big one, the First Mother's vessel, she's just sitting there. They're not running. They can't run. What do we do with 300 empty gods? There was a long pause across the dark. "That," said Calloway, "is the part the survey never wrote down. Hold your station, Outpost 2. The harvest is the easy half. Now we decide what kind of people we are." Aboard the Deep Watch flagship, in the cold quiet of a bridge that ran no hotter than it had to, Fleetmaster Idris Calloway watched the same harvest Lena watched, and read it differently, because he had spent 40 years learning to read it. He was an old man. The Deep Watch made old men of all its commanders, because the watch did not promote for daring, it promoted for patience, and patience was a thing that only came with years. Calloway had joined the watch the same year Lena Orsk was born. He had spent the decades between then and now studying 900 dead worlds, learning the shape of the thing that ate them, building in his head, and then in the dark, the exact trap that would take it. He had never expected to be alive when it sprang. The watch did not expect its commanders to see the end of the plans they laid. It expected them to lay good plans, and hand them forward, the way the first hand had handed the silence forward to the second, and the second to the third. That he had lived to close the ring himself was a kindness the watch had not promised him, and he had not asked for. He watched the seed come in, grain by grain, into the holds of the keel ships, and beside him, his numbers master called the count in a low, flat voice that never rose. 60 hulls dry, Fleetmaster. 90. 140. The resonance is holding clean. They tried to sing against it 40 minutes ago, and the older note took it. They have stopped trying. They are scattering now. Let them scatter, Calloway said. Where will they go without their seed? Count it. Keep counting. The count is the whole of what we are. That was the Deep Watch faith, and Calloway believed it the way the Increase believed in patience. The count was everything. The watch did not win by being braver than its enemy, or stronger, or faster. It won by knowing the exact number of everything, and being willing to wait however long it took for the numbers to come due. 40 years, 280 hulls, 312 soft bellies, 19 years of measured drift, 11 months of held breath aboard the Vigil. Every one of those numbers had been known before the trap was laid, and the trap had been built to fit them exactly, and now the numbers were paying out the way numbers always did, slowly, completely, without mercy and without haste. 180 dry, the numbers master said. 200. The big one, the First Mother's vessel, she is holding her belly closed. She knows what comes when she opens it. She is the last one full. She will open it, Calloway said. She has nowhere to take it. A breeder cannot hold its seed inside a closed ring forever. The seed needs the world. It is already dying in the bellies, slow, the longer it stays. She knows that better than we do. She will open the belly to spare the seed the dying, and we will take it the moment she does, and then there will be no increase left in this system, but the measure we choose to keep. He was quiet a moment. Hold the keel ships gentle. Every grain we crush is a grain we cannot give back, and the giving back is the whole point. Anyone can take a thing. We are going to do the harder one. His numbers master, who was younger, and who had not spent 40 years in the cold the way Calloway had, allowed himself a single question. Fleetmaster, we have them. 312 hulls, empty, helpless, in a closed ring. 900 worlds. We could end it. One word and 4,000 years of them is over, and no quiet world ever has to fear them again. Why give it back? Calloway did not turn from the count. Because if we end them, he said, then the next thing that hunts the quiet learns only that Earth kills. It does not learn to fear the silence. It learns to fear us, which is a smaller thing, a thing it can plan around, a thing it can come at with a bigger fleet. But if we take everything from the most patient predator in the dark, and then hand it back and send it home to tell the tale, the next thing learns that the quiet worlds bite, and that you cannot tell which quiet world will bite until it is far too late. That fear does not protect one world. It protects every quiet world there is, the ones we guard and the 10,000 we never could. We are not here to win a battle, son. We are here to make the whole galaxy afraid of the dark. You cannot do that with a graveyard. You can only do it with a witness. The numbers master was quiet after that, and went back to his count, and Calloway watched the last full belly in the ring, and waited for the first mother to do the thing he had known for 40 years she would have to do. 280 dry, said the numbers master, a long while later. 300, 311, a pause. The first mother has opened her belly, Fleet Master. The last one. The seed is coming in. Take it gently, said Calloway. Then we give it back. Then we decide what kind of people we are, and we let them watch us decide, so they carry the answer home. He folded his old hands and watched the last of a god's whole heart flow into the cold gray holds of his patient ships. 40 years, he said quietly, to no one. The first hand would have liked to see this. Count it clean, for them. Count it clean for all three hands. The fourth one is asleep down there on the warm world, and does not even know yet that they will spend their life being the quiet. Count it clean, so we can tell them it was worth the silence. Lena sat with that, alone in the cold command deck, and watched the harvest finish. She thought about the Eaton world the Deep Watch had stood in 40 years ago, the loud, brave world that had shouted and armed and called for help, and been folded into the warm, pale body anyway, with a survey note that said the field resisted briefly. She thought about the 900, and she found that she did not want, in this hour of winning, to become the thing that had made the 900. She did not yet know what Calloway intended, but she knew the Deep Watch, because she had given it 40 years of her one short life, and she knew it had never in all that time fired first, or fired last, at anything it did not have to. The whole faith of the watch was patience, and patience was not the same as cruelty, and she trusted that Calloway knew the difference even now, with a god's whole heart sitting empty and helpless in his closed gray ring. The harvest finished in the 11th hour, and when it was done, the pale increase was no longer a god. 312 soft pale hulls drifted in the closed gray ring, every belly hollow, every store of living spore lifted clean into the holds of the 40 keel ships. 4,000 years of carried faith now hung in the cold patient bellies of the Deep Watch, taken whole, spilled nowhere, not one grain of it lost to the dark, and not one grain of it left to the increase. The breeder empire that had come to seed a silent world floated in the center of the trap it had walked into for 19 years, and it had nothing left to fight with, and nothing left to flee for, because everything that made it itself was now in human hands. Sosh Veltara hung in the dim listening shell, and felt the silence she had loved her whole life turn against her at last. The drift made no songs now. There was nothing to sing. A breeder with an empty belly is not a warrior and not a god. It is only a slow, soft thing, alive but unmade, and the 312 of them drifted in the gray ring, waiting to learn how a people who had taken their faith would now take their lives. They were not afraid of dying. They had told themselves that for 4,000 years. They found, in the cold gray ring, that it had never quite been true, and that what they truly feared was this exact moment. The moment of being entirely at the mercy of a stronger thing, and having nothing to offer it but the begging the increase had made 900 worlds do. Sosh thought, in that helpless hour, of the worlds. She had never thought of them as anything but fields, fallow places filled and folded and forgotten. Now she hung empty in a closed ring, and felt, for the first time in her long life, the shape of the thing from the other side. She felt what it was to be the field, to have come to the end of every tactic and every patience, and have nothing left. No seed, no song, no strength. Only the slow, soft certainty that the stronger thing would now decide whether you continued to exist. 900 worlds had felt this. She understood that now, fully, in her body, the way her people understood everything. And she understood that the humans had built this entire 40-year silence, not only to win, but to make the increase feel exactly this, the field's last hour, so that it could never again pretend the fields had not felt it too. Aboard the flagship of the Deep Watch, Fleet Master Idris Calloway looked at the same 312 empty hulls and made the choice the survey had never imagined a strong people could make. His voice crossed the dark to the Vigil, and to every gray ship in the ring, and on a slow, patient channel his comms officers had spent 11 months learning, to the limp and silent drift itself. "This is the Earth Deep Watch," Calloway said. "We have your seed, all of it. We did not spill one grain, and we will not. Hear what that means, because you have never once in your long life heard it said to you. We could end you now. 300 empty hulls, no defense, no faith left to fight for. One word from me, and the gray ring closes, and there is no more increase, anywhere, forever. You have done that very thing to 900 worlds. You know exactly how easy it is. I want you to sit in the certainty that we know it too." The drift did not answer. It could not. But the First Mother turned her vast pale body toward the cold voice, and listened, because there was nothing else left to do. "We are not going to do it," Calloway said. In the dim shell, Sosh went rigid. "Here is what the silence was," the Fleet Master went on, unhurried, the way the increase itself had always been unhurried. 40 years ago, we found one of your fields. A world that had shouted when you came. A world that armed, and built, and called across the dark for anyone to help it, and got no answer, and was folded into you anyway, with a note in your own records that called it a brief resistance. We stood in what was left of it, and we learned the thing you have spent 4,000 years, teaching the galaxy, without ever meaning to teach it. Against a thing that hunts the quiet, loud is death. The loud worlds tell you where to push. The loud worlds make it easy. So we did the one thing none of your 900 ever did. We went quiet on purpose. We built our whole strength in the dark, where your surveys would never look. We made ourselves the fallow field. And we waited 40 years for you to mistake the strongest ambush in this galaxy for a thing too weak to live. You came all the way in, Calloway said, singing about how quiet we were. You brought your whole carried faith into the one room in the dark that was built to take it. We did not take it to kill you. We took it so that you would finally, for the first time in 4,000 years, be the one without the power. We took it so you would know what your 900 worlds knew, in the last hour, when the seed was already in the water, and there was nothing left to do but be filled. We wanted you to feel it, and now that you have felt it, we are going to do the thing none of those 900 worlds ever got to do for you. A new order moved through the gray fleet, and the 40 keel ships turned their broad, cold flanks toward the limp drift, and opened, very slowly, the holds. "We are giving it back," said Calloway. Sosh did not understand. The First Mother did not understand. The whole drift hung silent and uncomprehending, as the keel ships began, grain by patient grain, to return the harvested seed to the soft, empty bellies that had carried it. "Not all of it," Calloway said. "Hear me. We keep a measure. Enough to fill 40 cold storage worlds we have already prepared, deep and locked and watched, where your seed will live and grow, and never want for anything, and never, ever touch a living world again without our leave. That measure is our insurance, and our memory, and the price of the 900. One stored world for every 100 you ate. The rest, the great rest, we pour back into your hulls. You will leave this system alive. You will leave it whole. You will leave it carrying your faith, every grain we do not keep, and you will carry one more thing besides." The seed flowed back. Belly by belly, the drift came back to life, the limp fronds stirring, the slow songs trying and failing to find a key for a thing that had never happened before. The increase was being unkilled. The increase was being handed back its god by the hand that had taken it, and the hand was telling it why. "You will carry the knowing," Calloway said. "From this hour, the pale increase knows that a silent world might be the quietest grave in the galaxy. You will never again look at a fallow field and be certain. Every silence you find for the rest of your long life, you will wonder if it is empty, or if it is us, gone cold and dark and patient, waiting for you to come all the way in. You hunted the quiet, because the quiet could not fight. We have made the quiet the thing you fear most. Go home, First Mother, go home full, and tell every brood of the increase what the silence cost you here, so that 900 is the last number, and no more young worlds go quiet into your warm body believing no one is coming. The First Mother filled her command bladder with the returned seed and the returned breath, and for a long time she did not speak. When she did, her voice came across the patient channel to the gray flagship, and it was the voice of a god that has been unmade and remade in a single hour and will never be quite a god again. "Why?" she said. "You had us. The faith was in your holds. Why give it back? We would not have given it back. We have never given anything back." "I know," said Calloway. "That is the whole reason. You measure strength by what you can take. We are showing you a larger number. Strength is the size of the thing you can break, and choose not to. We could have ended 4,000 years of you in a single closing of the ring, and we chose, instead, to teach you. Remember which of us could do which. Then go home and be smaller, and be careful, and be afraid of the quiet. That is the harvest we came 40 years to grow." "You think we will keep the bargain," the First Mother said slowly. "You think we will not breed back the measure you took, and come again." "We think you will try," said Calloway, and there was no anger in it, only the dry patience of a people who had already counted this. "And we think you will look at the silence first, every time, and remember what one silence did to you, and turn away. We are not asking you to become good, First Mother. We do not need you good, we need you afraid. A god that fears the quiet stops eating the quiet, because it can never again be sure the quiet is not us. We have made every dark fallow field in this galaxy into a thing that might bite. That is the wall we put between you and the 901st. It is built of fear, and it will hold, because fear is the only thing your kind has ever truly respected." The gray ring opened. Sosha Veltara hung in the dim shell, and watched the cold walls part, watched the small yellow sun pour its thin light through the gap, watched the road home open in front of 312 soft pale hulls that had come to seed a silent world, and were leaving alive only because the silent world had decided to let them. She felt the returned seed warm in the belly of her vessel, the faith handed back grain by grain, by the hand that owned it now, and she understood, in the cold, patient way her people understood everything, that nothing in the increase would ever be the same. They had come to fill a quiet. They were leaving emptied of the one thing they had never lost in 4,000 years, which was the certainty that no quiet could ever hurt them. And Sosh, alone of all the drift, understood one thing more, and held it close, and did not say it aloud. The humans had not given the seed back out of weakness, and not out of softness, and not even, truly, out of mercy. They had given it back because a dead enemy carries no warning home, and the Deep Watch did not want the increase dead. It wanted the increase frightened, and talking, and spreading the fear to every brood across 4,000 years of dark, so that the silence would do for 10,000 quiet worlds what 280 gray ships could never reach to do. They had not spared the increase. They had recruited it. The First Mother would carry the warning home, and become, against her own will, the loudest voice the Deep Watch had ever fielded, and every world she taught to fear the quiet was a world the humans would never have to defend. It was, Sosh thought, the most patient cruelty she had ever seen, and it wore the face of mercy so well that the First Mother would never be entirely sure which one it had been. That uncertainty, too, was part of the harvest. The Deep Watch had grown even that. The drift turned for home in the 12th hour, and the Earth Deep Watch let it go. There was no pursuit. The gray walls simply opened and held open. 280 cold, patient hulls standing aside in perfect formation, while 312 soft, pale shapes gathered their returned faith and crawled slowly back out of the trap they had spent 19 years entering. The Deep Watch did not fire a single shot at a single belly in the whole 12 hours. It had never meant to. It had come to take a god's certainty, and a thing you have taken cannot be given back by killing the one you took it from. So the gray ships watched the drift go, and counted it out grain by hull the way they counted everything, and made sure that every one of the 312 left alive, full, and carrying the knowing home. Lena Orsk watched the last pale hull clear the ring from the high, cold orbit of the Vigil, and only when it was gone did she let herself feel the 40 years. She had been 19 when she joined the Deep Watch. She had given the best decades of her one short life to a silence that no one would ever thank her for, sleeping cold in 10-year shifts aboard a station the whole galaxy believed was a derelict, listening for a god to come and try to seed her home. She had heard the increase coming for 11 months, and said nothing. She had let 312 hulls full of poison crawl all the way down into her system on the strength of her own held breath, trusting that Calloway and the gray walls were where the charts said they were, that 40 years of silence would hold for one more hour, that the trap her people had built before she was born would close the way it was meant to. It had held, and now the god was going home unmade, and the blue world below had never even woken to know that anything had come for it at all. That was the part the Deep Watch never got to keep. The world it saved did not know. It could not know. The whole strength of the silence was that no one heard it, not the enemy, and not the saved. Down there, under the warm blue clouds, 11 billion people had slept through the night that decided whether their oceans stayed their own, and in the morning, they would wake and go about their small, loud lives, and never learn that a comms master named Lena Orsk had held her breath in the cold dark above them for 11 months, so that they would never have to. She found she did not mind. That was the other thing the Deep Watch taught you. In the long, cold shifts, you did not do it to be known. You did it because someone had to be the quiet, and the quiet was the strongest thing humanity had ever learned to be. Lena had read the old records, the few the Watch kept, and she knew that the first hand and the second hand had felt the same thing in their own last hours of their own long shifts, and had set it down in the same flat words she would use now. No one will know. That is the price. Pay it gladly. She had thought, when she was 19, that the price would be loneliness. She understood now, at the far end of her shift, that the price was something better and harder. It was the willingness to do the largest thing a person could do, and let it stay invisible forever, because the moment it became visible, it would stop working. The silence only saved the world so long as the world never heard it. Calloway's voice came across the relay one last time, and it had lost the dry hardness it wore for enemies. Outpost 2, clean record, end to end. You held a 40-year silence through the worst hour it was ever going to face, and you did not so much as let the station's heart beat too loud. The Deep Watch sees it. I see it. Stand down to watch state, comms master. Get some warm food. You've earned a quiet that's actually quiet. Copy actual, Lena said. Her voice did not shake. She had trained 40 years for it not to. Outpost 2 standing down to watch state. Vigil going dark. Not dark, Calloway said. Patient. There's a difference, and you of all people know it. Keep your eyes open. There are other gods out there, and they all believe the same lie about the quiet. One day, another one will come hunting a silent world. When it does, I want it to find you exactly where it left you, gray and cold and saying nothing, right up until the hour it learns what we are. And the seed? Lena asked. The measure you kept. Locked, deep, watched. On 40 cold worlds no survey will ever bother to chart, said Calloway. It will grow and never want, and never touch a living thing. Not punishment, comms master. Memory. Every grain of it is a name from the 900 we could not save, and a promise about the ones we will. We keep it so that we never forget what we were sparing them from, and never get soft enough to think the increase changed because we frightened it. It did not change, it only learned to be afraid. We keep the measure to stay afraid right back. That is the whole shape of the watch. Two patient things, each holding the other still with fear, across 4,000 years, so that the quiet worlds get to stay quiet. There was a pause. Rest, Lena. The fourth hand takes the next shift. You held it well. The relay closed. The gray fleet turned for its own cold parking orbits, sinking back toward the dark moons and the deep night beyond the 8th planet, and the long trench under the polar ice, going cold again, going silent again, becoming once more the empty system the next survey would chart, and the next god would dismiss. The keel ships carried their measured portion of the seed away to the 40 locked storage worlds, deep and watched and forever harmless, the insurance and the memory, and the price of the 900, and the vigil dimmed its lights along the long gray spine and became, to any eye that might be watching from the dark, a derelict again. A dead thing, a silence. Far out beyond the 8th planet, the drift of the pale increase crossed the edge of the system and turned its soft, pale noses toward the long road home. There was a moment, in the long road home, when the first mother nearly broke the bargain. It came on the third day out, when the small yellow sun had shrunk to a hard bright point behind them, and the warmth of the returned seed had steadied in the bellies of the drift, and the oldest reflex of the increase woke in her the way old reflexes do, in the quiet, when the fear has faded just enough to make room for pride. She had her seed back. She had 312 hulls. She had 4,000 years of patience, and a measure of grievance no god had ever carried. And for one slow hour she let herself think the thought the humans had warned her she would think, that she could breed back the measure they had taken, that she could come again, in a generation, with a fleet twice the size, and find the gray ships, and break them, and seed the blue world after all, and turn the humans' own mercy into the weakness that ended them. She sang the thought, very quietly, to Sosh, because a first mother does not keep her thoughts alone. Sosh listened to the whole of it, and combed her fronds flat, and when the old one was done, she answered with a question instead of an agreement, which was a thing a brood reader was permitted to do only once or twice in a long life. First mother, Sosh said, when we came to this system, how many hulls hid in the empty quarter that our 19 years of measuring never found? The first mother was silent. 280, Sosh said, built in the dark, under the ice, behind the moons, in orbits our instruments read as empty night. We measured that field for 19 years, and we found one gray derelict, and called the rest fallow. Now ask yourself the question that matters. If we come again with a fleet twice the size, how many hulls will hide in the dark that our measuring still cannot find? We do not know. That is the answer. We will never know. Because the thing they taught us, the true thing, under the mercy, is that we cannot read their silence. We never could. We thought we had measured an empty system, and we had measured the inside of a closed mouth. Come again with twice the fleet and you only bring twice as much seed into a dark you still cannot see the bottom of. They did not beat our fleet, First Mother. They beat our certainty. And you cannot rebuild a fleet against a thing whose strength is that you can never again be sure how strong it is. The First Mother hung in the warm dark and did not answer for a long time. Then, slowly, she let the old reflex go, and with it, the last of the gods she had been. You are right, she said. That is the cruelty I could not name. They did not take our seed, they gave the seed back. What they took was our ability to ever again believe a quiet, and there is no breeding that back. There is no fleet that buys it back. It is gone, and it is gone forever, and every dark field in the galaxy is poisoned with it now. She turned her vast pale body toward the long road. We will not come again, not because we are good, because we are afraid, exactly as they meant us to be, and the fear is the wisest thing we have ever carried. Make the record, Sosh. Make it true. Let no brood after us mistake the silence for a fallow field. That is the only seeding we have left to do. We will spend the rest of our 4,000 years seeding fear of the quiet, world to world, brood to brood, and every place we teach to fear it is a place the humans will never have to lift a hull to defend. They have made us their loudest voice. Set it down. Set down that we went to fill a silence, and the silence filled us, and we came home, its messenger, and were grateful, in the end, to be alive to carry the word. Sosh set it down. It became the first line of a record the pale increase would keep for the rest of its long history, copied into every brood, sung to every juvenile, before they were trusted with a sensing shell, the only lesson the increase ever learned that it had not learned by eating. The silence is not fallow. The quiet worlds are the deepest mouths in the dark. Measure everything. Trust no stillness you cannot read to the bottom. And never, never go to fill a world that has been quiet too long, because the longest quiet in the galaxy turned out to be the patience of a thing that was waiting, very calmly, for exactly you. In the command bladder of the lead vessel, the First Mother hung in the returned warmth of her faith, and did not speak for a long time. Around her, the drift sang nothing, because the songs of the increase had no key for this, no melody for a god that had been emptied and refilled by a hand it could not have stopped. They had come to seed a quiet world. They were leaving with their bellies full of seed they no longer owned the certainty of, every grain of it a gift from the people who could have ended them and did not, and worse than a gift, a lesson. Sosh Veltara drifted to the command bladder, her fronds combed flat against a silence that meant something new now. "First Mother," she said, "the young will ask why we turned back. 4,000 years, and we have never turned back from a fallow field. What do we tell them?" The First Mother turned her vast pale body toward the small yellow sun shrinking behind them, behind which a blue world slept, around which the cold gray ships were already going dark, and she spoke the only true thing the Increase had learned in the longest night of its long life. "Tell them the silence is not fallow," she said. "Tell them we found a quiet world and went to fill it, and the quiet world filled us instead, took the seed out of our bellies and handed it back to teach us a number larger than taking. Tell them the humans are out there in the dark, gone cold, gone silent, in every empty quarter we ever called spent. Tell them that the strength we never had was the strength to let an enemy live so it would carry the knowing home. And tell them, above all, that we are the knowing now. We are the warning. 900 worlds is the last number the Increase will ever count, because the 901st taught us to be afraid of the quiet." "And if a brood does not believe us?" Sosh asked. "If a young reader looks at a silent world and sees only a fallow field, the way we did, and goes to fill it?" "Then it will find what we found," the First Mother said, "or it will find nothing, and either way the lesson holds. The humans do not need us to believe them. They have made every silence in the galaxy into a question we can no longer answer. A young reader who goes to a quiet world now goes to it the way a thing walks into a dark room it has been told might hold a hunter. Slowly, listening, ready to turn back. That is the wall they built. Not around their world, around every quiet world there is. They cannot be everywhere. So they made the everywhere afraid for them." She was silent a long moment. "That is the cleverest cruelty I have known in 4,000 years, Sosh, and I cannot even hate them for it. Because the thing the cruelty protects is exactly the thing we spent 4,000 years destroying. They turned our own patience into a wall and put it between us and the harmless. I would have called that impossible. I have spent my whole life calling many things impossible. I am done calling things impossible. That too is something they gave back to me, along with the seed." She turned her great body once more toward the dark ahead, the long road home, the 4,000 years of broods that would have to be told. "They mistook our coming for strength," the First Mother said at last, very softly. "We mistook their silence for weakness. Only one of those two mistakes was ever going to be allowed to live, remember which. And never, never again, trust a quiet you cannot read." The drift crossed the dark and was gone. Behind it, the small yellow sun burned on, alone and unbothered. The blue world turned under its warm clouds and slept, and in the high cold orbit, the gray station called Vigil hung exactly where it had hung for 40 years, silent, patient, saying nothing, a derelict to any eye that cared to look. Inside it, a woman named Lena Orsk sat in the dim command deck with a warm bowl in her cold hands and watched the empty quarter, where a god had learned its lesson, and she let the silence settle back over her home, the way a blanket settles over a sleeping child. She thought, before the cold rest took her, about the fourth hand, some recruit not yet 19, somewhere on the warm blue world below, who would one day be brought up to the gray station in the dark, and told the shape of the silence, and given the long shift after hers. She would never meet that person either. She sat down, in the few flat words the watch allowed, the only thing she wanted the fourth hand to know. The silence holds. It held for 40 years, and it held for the worst hour, and it will hold for you. Be the quiet. No one will thank you. That is how you will know it is working. Then she sealed the record, where only the watch would ever find it, and let the cold come up over her, and the vigil went dark and patient around her, saying nothing, exactly as it should. The galaxy would go on believing the blue world was quiet. The galaxy would go on mistaking that quiet for weakness. And one by one, across the long, patient years, the gods who made that mistake would come hunting the silence, and find the silence hunting back, and go home unmade, and full and afraid, carrying the only thing the Deep Watch ever asked them to carry. The knowing that the quiet worlds were the deadliest worlds of all. Somewhere out in the dark, another god was surely coming. They always came. They mistook the silence for weakness, every one of them, right up until the hour the Deathworlder fleet moved. The vigil went quiet, and it kept its eyes open,